When you think about maritime tragedies, the very first ship that comes to your mind is almost certainly the Titanic. It is the ultimate symbol of disaster on the high seas, known by almost every person on the planet. But if you were to ask this exact same question to anyone living in South Korea, they would give you a completely different name without a single moment of hesitation: the Sewol. Back when the Titanic met its fate, the lack of lifeboats was the main reason so many people did not survive. But in our modern era, we like to believe that this critical flaw has been completely fixed and left in the past. Today, massive cruise liners sail the oceans with an absolute abundance of state-of-the-art rescue craft on board. These modern lifeboats are designed to carry incredibly large numbers of people, and they are fully stocked with everything necessary for long-term survival, including fresh water and food supplies. We trust these floating cities because we are told they're built to withstand almost anything. Yet, the painful truth is that even the most advanced rescue equipment is not always guaranteed to save us when a crisis actually strikes. When a cruise ship named the Viking Sky found itself caught in a truly terrifying and violent storm. The massive vessel was tossed around by the waves, losing power and drifting dangerously close to jagged coastal rocks. Fortunately, through sheer luck and the efforts of rescuers, not a single person on that cruise liner lost their life during the ordeal. This was an absolute miracle, as experts who analyzed the incident later concluded that if the Viking Sky had crashed into those rocks, more than 1,000 passengers could have easily perished. But today, we're going to look at a tragedy where the threat did not come from a sudden natural disaster, but from a complete and systemic failure of human responsibility. If you want to understand the true story of the Sewol Ferry, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and let's dive into the details. Let us go back to the beginning of this heartbreaking story, which took place in South Korea. The Sewol was a passenger ferry carrying a total of 476 people on board. Among the passengers, there was a massive group of 325 students and their teachers from Ansan High School. For these young people, this was not just a simple trip, but a highly anticipated school excursion, a joyous milestone that every student looks forward to. Their destination was the beautiful sunny resort island of Jeju, and the ferry had departed from the port of Incheon the previous evening. The night portion of the journey passed quietly and peacefully, with students chatting in their cabins, sharing snacks, and taking photos to remember the trip. No one could have possibly predicted the absolute chaos that was waiting for them just a few hours later. As the morning sun began to rise, the Sewol was navigating through a notoriously dangerous and difficult stretch of water. Suddenly, for reasons that would later shock the nation, the vessel made an incredibly sharp and abrupt turn, causing it to lose its balance. Within moments, the massive ferry began to tilt heavily to one side, listing at an angle that made it impossible to stand up straight. With terrifying speed, the Sewol began to capsize, and water started to threaten the lower decks. In any standard maritime emergency, the captain and the bridge crew are expected to immediately broadcast a distress signal to the Coast Guard. But on this tragic morning, the very first call for help did not come from the experienced officers on the bridge. Instead, it came from a terrified student who was trapped inside a tilting cabin and realized that something was horribly wrong. Feeling the floor slide away beneath him, the boy grabbed his mobile phone and dialed the emergency services. "Please help us," he cried into the receiver, his voice shaking with panic. "Our ship seems to be sinking. The ship is sinking right now." The operator on the other end of the line, completely unprepared for such a call, was visibly confused and asked, "Wait, is this the ship you are actually on, or are you looking at another ship sinking near you?" "No, it is the ship I am on. The name of the ship is the Sewol. It's the Sewol." This frantic call from a frightened teenager was the first time authorities learned of the disaster. Only several long and precious minutes after the student's emergency call did the professional crew on the bridge finally contact the vessel traffic control center. "This is the Sewol. Do you copy?" The radio transmission crackled. The Maritime Traffic Control responded immediately, recognizing the extreme danger of the situation. "Sewol, this is traffic services. An evacuation must be ordered directly by your captain. You need to make a decision right now. In almost any other maritime emergency, this would have been the exact moment when the alarm bells started ringing and a highly organized evacuation began. The crew should have run through the corridors, helping passengers put on life jackets and guiding them to the upper decks where they could safely board the lifeboats. But what happened next on the Sewol was a complete nightmare. Instead of ordering the passengers to leave the ship, the crew made a decision that would prove to be fatal for hundreds of families. They kept the passengers in the dark, refusing to share the severity of the listing and choosing instead to rely on a strategy of complete silence. Over the ship's public address system, an automated announcement began to play on repeat, echoing through every corridor and cabin. Please do not move. Remain in your designated positions. Do not move. Stay exactly where you are. Because this disaster occurred in the modern era, almost every high school student on board had their mobile phones with them, and they began recording what was happening inside. In these heart-wrenching videos, you can hear the ship's intercom calmly repeating the instruction to stay put, while the teenagers, completely unaware of the mortal danger they were in, joked around and tried to keep their spirits up. Please do not move. Stay where you are. Hold on to any available railing, the voice repeated as the floor tilted further. This is absolutely crazy, one student can be heard saying on video, capturing the bizarre reality of the situation. But wait, isn't this exactly like one of those movies where they tell you to stay in your seats and promise that everything will be fine, only for the people in charge to run away and save themselves? That actually happened in a train accident once. The only people who survived were the ones who refused to follow the orders. At that moment, those young students had no idea that their words were tragically accurate. They trusted the adults, they trusted the school authority, and they trusted the captain, unaware that this obedience would trap them inside the sinking vessel. While hundreds of young passengers were waiting in their cabins, believing that a rescue operation was actively underway, the state's official response was incredibly slow and disorganized. Why did the government fail to deploy its full power on that critical morning when every single second mattered? The answer lies in a shocking chain of bureaucratic paralysis. The Coast Guard was desperately trying to establish contact with the office of the president, the Blue House. The president's office, in turn, was supposed to convey the emergency to the president herself. But this raised a massive and deeply disturbing question. Where was the president during these golden hours of the disaster? For a very long time, her location and her lack of response remained a closely guarded state secret. Because the flow of information was delayed at the highest levels, the situation on the water became worse with each passing minute. When the first Coast Guard boats finally arrived at the Sewol, they were stunned to see that the outer decks were completely empty, as no passengers were attempting to leave. Because the captain of the Sewol had refused to order an evacuation, the students remained inside, believing they would be saved if they just followed instructions. On the scene of this major disaster, the South Korean national television channels began broadcasting a completely different story. "We have wonderful news for everyone today," the smiling news anchors proclaimed. "Every single person on board the ferry has been successfully rescued." The reports claimed that the incident had occurred early in the morning and that within just 2 hours, everyone had been safely pulled from the sinking ship. This was a complete and utter lie, manufactured to prevent public panic and protect the government's reputation. The parents watching at home temporarily breathed a sigh of relief, unaware of the horror that was actually unfolding. As the water rose higher inside the ship, the teenagers began to panic, calling their parents for guidance. Most parents naturally gave their children the advice they thought was safest. Follow the instructions of the crew and trust your teachers, because they are adults and they know best. But in this case, that trust proved to be fatal. While the students were dutifully waiting in their cabins as instructed, the captain of the Sewol was preparing to save his own life. In a shocking piece of footage recorded during the disaster, a man can be seen crawling out of the ship's bridge and stepping onto a rescue boat, dressed in civilian clothes. That man was the captain himself, leaving hundreds of children trapped inside.
그때도 제가 이제 저기 하니까 선생님 말씀 잘 듣고 근데 그게 제일 후회스럽더라고요. 그러니까 애를 빨리 나오라고 그랬는데 제 배의 상황을 몰라갖고 무조건 선생님 말씀 잘 듣고 있으라고. 선생님 하라는 대로 잘하라고 알았다고 저기 하라고. 근데 그게 이제는 그 뒤에 전화를 하니까 안 되더라고요, 전화가.
That was the last time she ever spoke to her daughter. Less than 2 hours after the listing began, the Sewol was almost completely submerged beneath the cold ocean waters. In the final moments, a group of students on the deck was washed away, and civilian fishing boats rushed to pull them from the freezing water. It was a chaotic, desperate effort for survival, carried out entirely without the help of the official rescue forces. Back on the shore, the parents were in absolute shock. Just minutes ago, they had been exchanging text messages with their children, and now the ferry had vanished beneath the surface. Yet government officials continued to lie, publicly stating, "We did not search the cabins, but it appears almost all of the students managed to escape before the ship sank." In reality, the vast majority of the students remained trapped inside the submerged ship. Meanwhile, the public demanded to know where President Geun-hye was during these critical hours. Her administration claimed she was performing her duties from her residence, but the investigation later revealed a shocking truth. She had spent the entire morning asleep in her bed, completely unaware of the disaster. The negligence of the crew was staggering. It was later revealed that while the ship was actively sinking, one crew member spent his time drinking beer instead of helping the passengers. This detail caused immense anger and shock among the parents, who were still holding on to hope that their children might be alive inside the sunken vessel. They demanded that rescuers search for air pockets inside the ship. Air pockets can form inside submerged vessels, trapping oxygen and allowing people to survive underwater for a limited time. Such miracles are scientifically documented. For example, in 2013, a man was rescued after surviving in an air pocket 30 meters below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. To reach these potential air pockets, divers plan to use diving bells, specialized underwater lift chambers that allow divers to descend quickly without wasting energy or being swept away by strong currents. However, local professional divers who observed the government-contracted teams quickly realized that the equipment was being set up completely incorrectly. When I checked their equipment, I was horrified by how unstable and unreliable it was. A local professional diver later testified in court. I told them that this setup would kill their own divers before they could ever hope to rescue the children, but they replied that they had to make a show of it because the president was watching them. Instead of carrying out a real professional rescue effort, the government divers were merely pretending to work, lowering useless equipment into the water to satisfy the media and the politicians. While they staged this theater for the cameras, precious time was ticking away in the dark, cold depths below. On national television, the government continued to broadcast fabricated statistics to the public. The news reported that 640 divers, 720 rescue personnel, 261 vessels, and 35 aircraft were actively working around the clock to find the students. But the parents waiting at the shore could see with their own eyes that the water was empty and silent. Amid all this corruption and government failure, a true hero stepped forward, a local professional diver named Mr. Lee. Horrified by the news that the children were still trapped inside the submerged ship, Mr. Lee decided he had to act. He owned a highly advanced professional diving bell that was far superior to the government's equipment. However, transporting this heavy diving bell to the site required a large barge and cost a tremendous amount of money, specifically $150,000. When Mr. Lee discussed this with his wife, she supported him without a second of hesitation. "I will handle the money, you just go and save those kids." But when Mr. Lee arrived at the scene with his state-of-the-art equipment, the Coast Guard refused to let him dive. The reason for blocking him was deeply sinister. The government-contracted teams were terrified of being exposed. If Mr. Lee successfully deployed his diving bell and located survivors, the entire country would immediately realize that the government's previous claims and rescue efforts had been a complete lie. To protect their own reputations, they chose to keep Mr. Lee on the sidelines. While the government blocked Mr. Lee from entering the water, the state-run media began running slanderous news reports about him, claiming that he had voluntarily backed out and refused to help. This was a devastating blow to a man who had spent his own fortune just to reach the site. When Mr. Lee's team was finally allowed to deploy their diving bell the following day, the Coast Guard did something truly shocking. As Mr. Lee's team began their dive, a Coast Guard vessel suddenly steered directly into their barge, physically ramming it. The collision put the lives of the divers who were currently working deep underwater at extreme risk. With everything smoking and damaged, the dive was forced to a halt, and Mr. Lee had to return to shore with nothing. Upon his return, Mr. Lee was met with anger and accusations from both the media and a portion of the parents, who had been led to believe that he had failed them on purpose. The very institutions that were supposed to protect the public instead used their power to sabotage a genuine rescue attempt, ensuring that the truth remained hidden beneath the waves.
2 years after the tragedy, the Sewol was finally raised from the ocean floor, and investigators recovered hundreds of mobile phones from the cabins. The data on these phones revealed a heart-shattering truth. There was photographic evidence of active air pockets, proving that many students survived for a long time inside the dark, cold hull, waiting for a rescue that never came. The political fallout was swift but incomplete. President Park Geun-hye was eventually impeached and sentenced to 25 years in prison, not for the Sewol tragedy, but for an unrelated corruption scandal, and she was later pardoned in 2021. Tragically, the local diver who served as the voice of the grieving families in court died by suicide 2 years after the disaster, unable to bear the emotional trauma. Even South Korean K-pop artists who spoke out about the tragedy found themselves blacklisted by the government, forcing many to express their grief through subtle, symbolic imagery in their music videos. 10 years later, the scars of the Sewol remain deep, and the survivors are still left with a haunting, unanswered question. If they had only told us to leave the ship, we would have all survived. Why did nobody come to save us? If you want to support our work and ensure stories like this are never forgotten, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel.